Welcome to Fitness Lab Pittsburgh, aka Fit Lab Pittsburgh, with our first live Facebook video that works. If you're not able to listen to the whole thing, we have this recording, so you should be able to listen to it a few days down the line when we post it. We are fortunate enough today to have a guest with us, Kelly Kuhn of Kelly Kuhn Physical Therapy. Obviously, she is a physical therapist. She's been on our podcast before when it's been strictly audio. And what we like about having Kelly on is she can give you practical information if you are either an experienced runner or just coming back. Don't forget that FitLab Pittsburgh promotes the ethos that movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. And one of the easiest ways to move is to move by running. And I think we'll have an interesting conversation. If you have questions, please type the questions on Facebook and we will attempt to answer some of them. If this goes well, we're going to attempt to do something like this about once a month. Kelly, thank you for taking time to talk to FitLab PGH.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I think it's really opportune that we have it tonight because the last few weeks, for anybody who's in the Pittsburgh area, there's been all kinds of crappy weather. If you like to run outside, it's been very icy, and it's actually the last day or so, it's gotten warm enough that some people may be transitioning from treadmills to outside or saying spring's finally started. I can start training for that virtual half marathon, or maybe if you're lucky, the real marathon someplace. And for other people, they can put down the snowshoes, the cross-country skis, or maybe the yak tracks and start running. So one of the things that I think is a good place to start with is as a physical therapist, I think you would agree with me, there's no such thing as a runner who hasn't been hurt. It's only runners who are currently hurt or runners who have been hurt in the past. So if you just are thinking for some advice for maybe friends of yours, you know, they're starting back outside, maybe they've taken time off, done some other activities. What are some things that they should be aware of? Maybe one or two things to take home as they start their running program. It was 60 degrees today and it's really easy to do too much.
Yes, I mean it was beautiful out today, and I was thinking about that as I was out there. You just want to go. You feel so good. We've been cooped up, and we just want to go. And I think especially this year more than ever, there's probably been less training in the winter. I think people were just kind of fed up. They were tired, and with this weather being as bad as it was in the middle of COVID, people just probably didn't train that much. So I think we can't look back a year ago and start where we were a year ago. Like that is number one. I think a lot of people are going to just try to jump back in. We have to take a little step back. We have to evaluate where we were and make sure that we're not taking a huge jump in because the weather feels good. And also, if we're moving from the treadmill to overground, there's some differences, right? So there's going to be more load on the knee off the treadmill. So we don't want to necessarily increase how much we're running on the ground from where we were on the treadmill, because then we're more likely to kind of flare something. The good news is, though, if you go out and you run a little extra today, hopefully, you just felt good that it wasn't, too much. Just later on this week, back off a little bit. Like you had a heavy run today, change up your program a little bit so that maybe if you were supposed to have a huge run a few days from now, then maybe you tone that run back a little bit so that your overall increase isn't that drastic. So it doesn't always have to be, one run. We can look at the overall picture.
And I know people are often wondering, one of the things that we have in Pittsburgh that I think is one of the unrecognized gems is we have a significant number of rails to trails, both hard surfaces and soft surfaces. And I'm curious, as a physical therapist who works with runners, do you see more injuries from runners who spend most of their times running on the harder surfaces, the softer surfaces, or kind of just a mixed bag? It all depends on the training program and the individual runner.
I don't see a ton of differences. I think sometimes when we see more on like the uneven surfaces, we'll see a little more foot injuries. But really, it's a mixed bag. I don't think the surface plays as huge of a role as we think, because we're pretty good at adapting to the surface. So I don't think that's too much of where I see a big change in my injuries.
And for somebody, I think this is also, there's, as you mentioned, COVID has hit everybody hard. It's been a significant change. We're coming up on almost a year since most of us have recognized, hey, this is going to change something. And often there's the idea of, I want to break out with something big. Everybody's got vacation plans. They want to go here or there. And it's often somebody may come up with an idea. They get hung up on doing some sort of an event. And just as a physical therapist, if you've got a runner or somebody who's healthier comes to you, how do they decide, It's very easy to get caught up in saying, I'm going to run a marathon. When you're a physical therapist and you're looking at a runner, and I know you do evaluations for people periodically, what are some things that you tell them to decide if this is the year to do a marathon or not? And how much time should people allot to prepare for it if they're starting from, say, recreationally running 3 times a week for 3 to 4 miles at a time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the things that we're going to look at are, overall health. We have to take into account how healthy we are, and that includes sleep, diet, and stress. Mental health is huge for runners, because if we're stressed out, that's going to lower our tolerance to load and make us more likely to get injured. Not necessarily that we will, but just more likely. So we want to have somebody, when I evaluate a runner to determine where they're at, we don't just look at them physically. We're going to talk about their lifestyle, their sleep, how much time can they actually dedicate to training? Because we know one of the most important things for running is consistency. That doesn't mean we're out there running a ton of miles every day, but we need to be consistently running. So can you, in this time with kids and everything else being all crazy, can you dedicate the time that it takes to train? And yes, it can take, months to train for a marathon. I think the prerequisite for a marathon is, I'm terrible with numbers right off the top of my head, is about 6 miles. You need to be running like 6 miles consistently. And then you'd probably need about 18 weeks to train for that marathon. So that's a good chunk of time. So I think we need to look at those things. We need to look at their history of injuries. If they're coming off an injury, have they rehabbed that injury fully? Are they resistance training? That's really important, because resistance training does help us to build our tolerance to injuries. It helps us to build our tissue tolerance. It helps us learn good movement strategies to keep us running better. It's not just about being strong. It helps our brain figure out the best, most optimal way to run. And so I think we need to make sure that somebody has like a little bit of background in resistance training. Have you run a race before? I don't think anybody should go from not running to running a marathon. Do some 5Ks. Get the feeling of a race. Get the idea of training under your belt. And I think you mentioned that they were already running 3 miles, but one thing is, before anybody starts to run, can you power walk for 60 minutes? I mean, if you can't walk fast for 60 minutes, you're not going to tolerate distance running, and you might need to build up to that program. So there has to be a prerequisite in your training program before you start to commit to that marathon training program. And I think a lot of people think, okay, hey, my whole office is going to run a marathon today. Let's start training. And that's just a recipe for disaster. There's work that goes into before we even sign up for the race.
That's great advice. I think it's also important to remember that you don't have to run a marathon to be a runner. I know back when I did triathlons, there was somebody who was significantly faster than me who did half Ironman triathlons. And I asked him once, I said, why don't you do Ironman? He goes, my body doesn't withstand that. So there are some people who just probably, unless it takes an incredible amount of resistance training and work with a physical therapist for biomechanical abnormalities, they may not be well suited for a marathon just because structurally how they're made up.
Yes. And I think emotionally too, like from a mental health standpoint, training for a marathon can be a lot, and it can be really great for mental health, and it can be, if it's done properly, but it can also be something that tears you down or really takes away from your life if we're not doing it if we don't have the right reason for the goals, if we don't have the right training, all of that. So it is important to look at it from a mental health aspect as well.
I'm reminded of a good friend of mine when he finished his first Ironman triathlon. He was standing there, obviously with a beer in his hand, and he turns to me and he goes, well, that wasn't really life-changing. I enjoyed it. I'll do it again, but I really like the training more. And I think you hit really a key there. Why are you doing the certain event? For some people, it's because they want to collect little checks off their boxes. And I suspect they may not be as successful as somebody who's saying, I just enjoy being outside, and hey, there's this really cool marathon someplace where I can take my family. We can have a nice vacation after I do the race, and I'll have a neat memory to tell friends, rather than, okay, I've got a marathon. What's the next thing I can do?
Yes, yeah. I think everybody has different reasons for training, and sometimes the most successful runners also have very dark reasons for training. That's what's driving them, and they don't always admit that. And I think when we realize that, we can kind of teeter out like how important is this race to you, and is it a beneficial thing to you for your mental health? Is it something that is taking away from it, but you still want to do it for other reasons, or is it something that maybe we could do with a 10K or find another event or challenge that might be better suited for you?
And I think that brings us to a great point that we hadn't really talked about, but sometimes conversations go in that direction with mental health, with injuries. I think somebody who wants to be active as a runner and make it a lifetime of movement, they need to think about collecting people that are kind of, in air quotes, their team. And obviously, the first is if you have a significant other and family members, you need to make sure that the home team is willing to do it. I suspect if you get off this Facebook Live and go to your husband and say, hey, guess what? I'm going to train for a marathon in June and you're responsible for all the childcare on weekends because I'm going to be doing long runs, it probably isn't going to go well. But they also need a physical therapist. They also need a coach. And I think you hit on the point, and this I think is why I like having you on various FitLab Pittsburgh events. You don't step outside your boundaries or your level of knowledge. And I think that's important for people because I think you hit a great point with, understand why you're doing the event. The people who are part of your support team, I think, make sure they're qualified. And I think this is a great opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about when you see runners who are injured, what are some common training errors that you can say, boy, if I had $1 for every time I see this with somebody who comes to me with an injury, and especially given this time of year, it doesn't necessarily have to be a runner. It could be a cross-country skier. It could be somebody training for triathlons. What are the 2 or 3 training errors that when you look at the people who come to you, you say, ooh, that's a red flag. Let's correct that so I don't see you here on a regular basis.
Well, I think the two things are they're not managing load properly, or managing their training. So and that's not just following a specific training guide. It's kind of tailoring their training to fit them, and then which I'll touch on more in a second. And then the second would be that they're not resistance training. And I didn't say strength training. I specifically said resistance training because it's about more than just strength. But so for the load management, I think the thing I heard this related to COVID restrictions lately about turning the restrictions as a dial instead of an on-off switch. And I'm not going to talk about COVID restrictions, but I thought the analogy was great. Like runners, like they get pain and they shut it down, and then it feel better, and then they turn it back on. And that's when that's just a recipe for cycling into injuries. So I think the most important thing is for us to know, like when we have an injury, to dial it back, and so you have this training program. So a lot of times people will just get their training program off the internet, or maybe even a coach gives it to them. And it's written at the beginning of their training season. And then life changes and we have injuries and we have stress, diet, sleep, and all of those factors are going into how much load we can tolerate before we get injured. So our nervous system adapts. If we're not sleeping well, we're going to be more wound up and we're more likely to get injured. Same with diet or stress. So it's not just the training. We have to look at the whole person. And so I want runners to learn to dial it back to kind of, before they run, do an inventory, kind of reconnect. So many people are stressed and don't realize that they're stressed. Am I really tired today? Am I really stressed today? Did I eat well? Have I fueled well? And I really have been recommending more and more of my runners to dietitians because the fueling is hugely important. And then then kind of saying, what I'm supposed to do, 18 miles today. Maybe today we do a lighter run. Maybe today we do, maybe we change it around a little bit because I still want you to run, but because the consistency is the key, but we don't always have to follow the plan to the T. Or if we have pain, a lot of rest is not good. We need to just learn to back off a little bit. When we rest, we lower our tissue's ability to tolerate load. And running is a high load activity. So our tissues, our bones, our tendons, they have to be able to tolerate that load. And so that's the whole idea of building in the training program. It's not just about building cardiovascular strength. That goes faster. We're building our tissue tolerance to that load. And so when we take weeks off because we have an injury, our tolerance to load goes way down. So people take time off, the injury feels better, but they actually haven't rehabbed the injury. They just rested it. It's now technically less resilient. And then we jump back in and we get injured. So if we could say, okay, my knee hurts today, how can I dial back? How can I just turn it back? Maybe we change, the amount of hill work we're doing. Maybe we cut back our distance. Maybe we play with cadence a little bit. Anything we can do to keep them running, but in a acceptable way. So we won't say that there's pain. If you're training for a marathon, you're going to train through a little bit of pain. I mean, that's a given. We have to know that. But is that pain staying pretty stable? Is it in an acceptable range to you? And within 24 hours after the run, is it back to your baseline level of pain? And if we're kind of staying there, that's a good place to train in. If pain is continually increasing, if it makes you limp, if it, is really, really aggravated 24 hours later, well, then we need to either dial back more or start looking for other causes. But I think if I can get most runners to learn to just tone back and then rebuild back up, we're going to manage the injuries better. So it was the first. And then do you have any questions about that before I move into?
When you say tone back, I think it's a great opportunity to add in the comment that there's no shame in walking. I mean, if you ever see people running in the city, they get to a stoplight and they're moving like this and running in place. I don't think it's a bad thing to stop for the 30 seconds or to periodically walk. I know there's the one of the great first-time training programs that's very successful is the Jeff Galloway training program, which part of it incorporates walking. And I think that's something that people underestimate. It's like, well, I need to run a marathon. Well, you can walk at a pretty fast pace.
Yeah, I'll start people who have never run before on a walk run, or most of my runners who are injured and coming off an injury will go through a walk run progression. And like a lot of people they always think about the cardiovascular side of things. So they want to go, oh, I'm injured, let me bike and let me swim, which there's nothing wrong with that. But really, you're not building the bone and resilience, the tissue resilience the same way with biking and swimming, but you are with walking. So if we can keep people, if the very minimum is that you can't run at all, you can't tolerate it, but you can walk, that's still on the spectrum there of where we want to be. That's if you rest all the way, you come all the way back to here. But if you're walking, you're here. I have less room to get you back. So, or it's easier to get you back. So I'm a huge proponent of walking. It's also a way to kind of you kind of hit your max with running. Well, then you can go walk a little bit and add a little extra stress, like a little, active recovery to get the tissues to adapt more. So, because we adapt to stress. So we don't want to over stress it because then we'll set off a pain signal. But if we can add a little stress with an extra walking at the end, our tissues will adapt to that, and that increases our capacity. So walking is great. I'm a huge proponent of walking.
I think one of the other things that you've hit on with the load that people need to think about, because sometimes we lose the simple message or we lose the tree in the forest, is if you think about anybody who's out there who's not an elite runner, and obviously that's an entirely different story and topic of way of dealing with people, but for the typical person who runs a half marathon or a marathon, and when they have to slow down in the race, or they say I didn't run as fast, if they look at why they had to slow down, I suspect the majority of time they're going to find out that it's something musculoskeletal that slowed them down. They weren't like, well, I had to slow down because my heart rate was going too fast at mile 20. It was more along the lines of, well, my foot hurt or my shin hurt or the outside of my knee hurt. So I think you hit on the point there that the resistance training and recognizing that equipping the tissues to handle the load is vitally important. And it's not just well, I'm a runner, so my legs get enough work, so I don't need to do resistance training for my legs.
Mm-mm. Running does not build your legs for running. We need to, and it's not just about strength, so it's everybody who runs a little different. Like every movement we make is slightly different. If you watch somebody walking from behind and them, you can tell it's them just by the way they move. We have distinct movements, and that is our strategy for how we do that. And so when a runner gets injured, It's because the load has exceeded that strategy's ability to handle it. And that could be just a training error. It could be that, they were just not sleeping well, or they upped too fast, they took too much time off. So obviously we're going to look at that. We're going to try to figure out how to get their training back into the realm that their strategy can handle. But when we start adding resistance training, we do two things. One, we take that strategy and we make that strategy more resilient, so the tissues can handle more load, they can build. But the other thing we do is we actually give ourselves a chance to learn a new strategy. Because I explained it this, like how we learn a strategy is, I like the metaphor of a toddler learning to drink a glass of water. So when they go to drink that sippy cup, they're like all over the place at first, and they just keep trying, and then they eventually get it. What they never do is they never say, I'm going to turn my wrist 30 degrees and then I'm going to bend my elbow and they're just like, let me drink this water, because that's how our brain works. And every time the movement is different. Sometimes the water is farther away, sometimes there's more water in the cup, sometimes it's a different size cup, and their brain learns to adapt for all those different variables, and all they're thinking is, I want to drink this water. So when we're working with runners, sometimes we're cueing them, like, hey, you've got to push off this toe or do this. And that's so outside the scope of the way our brain works. Not that we don't ever use those cues like that. But what happens with resistance, when you take them with a movement like a squat, for example, and you load it up and you put some heavy weight on it and you have them, you're now challenging that system. The brain has to find a way to do it. It wants to find a way to do it. So it's going to look for new strategies. And it's a good way for us to start to handle new strategies. So when we're out there running, no matter what surface we're hitting, no matter how our foot is falling, our pace, whether we're uphill or downhill, the brain can start to find a better strategy that works for them. And that's why resistance training is really, really important. On top of also building the tissue load, it gives our body a chance to learn better ways to move without like making it so mechanical. Like, hey, try to, like, I don't like to cue people to strike on a certain part of their feet or, squeeze certain muscles or any of that. That's just not a good way to run. It's just, I want it to happen more natural.
And I think that with the resistance training comments, I think that brings a question. I've said before, one of the great things about the internet is it's a great source of information. One of the great things about the internet is there's a lot of bad information on it. And if we pulled up any of the social media things and started looking at resistance training for runners, we would see a huge variety of things that people do. And I wanted to get your feedback or your thoughts on runners who say, well, I only do lifting, or the resistance training that I do it on top of a Bosu ball or balancing on a Swiss ball versus being on the ground. What are your thoughts when patients ask you about that?
I think if you're looking for strength, you're taking away strength, because as soon as you change the surface, like you can't generate as much power on a unstable surface. And so we're looking for, to be able to generate strength, generate that power. So I'm not a huge proponent of unstable surface training. I'd rather, be on a stable surface and load it up, go a little heavier, and get that power to get those strategies, things like that. There's a time and place for that type of training, really more for vestibular stuff. And, you can throw it in some places for certain things, but I don't see a huge benefit for runners. And like you said, there's a plethora of information out there. I mean, runners, how many hours are we asking them to run? Their main thing is to run consistently. So I'm not going to pick these crazy exercises. I want to keep their resistance programs short and sweet. Like 4 to 5 exercises, 2 to 3 times a week, depending where they are in their running season, because they need to run and they have to have a life too. So I don't want to. You can find value for those things, but they're not going to fit into like our time. I'd rather work with just, the basics. I want to load the tissues that we're going to use when running. And if you have extra time, go ahead, do whatever, do all that other stuff. but I challenge you to find a runner who's training for a marathon who has extra time.
And I know you've mentioned resistance training a variety of times. A year into COVID, for periods of time here in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, fitness centers, health clubs, gyms, whatever you want to call it, whatever your favorite place to go is, were closed. is it possible for a runner without spending a lot of money to set up their home gym so they can do the resistance training to be a successful runner? And as a physical therapist, if a runner came to you and said, what are the one or two things that you'd recommend I get so I can do some resistance training at home? Because if you have to get in the car, drive to the gym, walk in the gym, sign in, wait to use machines or wait to use free weights and come home, it's a significant outlay of time compared to if you can go downstairs or out to your patio and do your resistance training at home.
Yeah, I mean, I work, obviously doing telehealth. I work with a lot of people in their home. So we can find ways to do it without any equipment, using body weight, things like that. But Chris Johnson, who is a great, I think I reference him on every podcast I'm on with you. He released a cinder block series where he has a whole workout that is centered around using a cinder block as your weight. So, I mean, you can get creative. You can use just something to give you some resistance. So you can use objects around the house. I like to, if a few dumbbells go a long way, some bands go a long way. I like a step. I use the step a lot. But a lot of people have a step in their house, so that's not necessarily something. I would say anything to give you some weight. So dumbbells, kettlebells, get a few, or an adjustable one. Like I said, you can work with the cinder block. Sandbags work, but I really like those bigger, thicker monster bands. As long as you have somewhere you can attach them, you can make those do a lot of things. You can you can attach those bands to a broomstick and turn that into resistance. So we can be creative, based on someone's budget and what they have in their house. There's lots of ways to do it. One other thing you can do. We can also slow down the exercise more. So if you really, really slow down a squat and make it and hold and pause, you can account for not having as much resistance as well, too. So that's another way to make it harder, even though you don't have the equipment.
I'd also add in that there's nothing wrong with having a suspension trainer hanging in the middle of your living room or the middle of your office.
Mm-hmm. I have one right there.
So I know one of the things that I've hit on a couple of times, as you said, or you mentioned that you like resistance training. You've talked about mental health. You've talked about referring patients to dietitians. And I think we've hit on, somebody who's looking to run a race or run a marathon or do a summer event successfully. And by successfully, I classify that three ways. First of all, they don't have a life-altering experience where they end up in the hospital or they end up passed out because they weren't equipped for that. Second of all, they had a reasonably enjoyable experience. I think there's very few people, even at a fairly high level, who enjoy it. I know all the time. I know we interviewed Paul Thompson for Moving to Live, who is a elite masters runner, a Brit, and his comment for his first marathon was, I think it was around 17 miles, and he said it with his droll British accent. It suddenly occurred to me that I might not finish. And this is a gentleman who's run in the 230s. I believe he's also broken 230. So very good. So you got a dietitian, you've got a physical therapist, or depending on their training, a chiro. I know some chiros and physical therapists work very closely together. Somebody who's a mental health professional. And it's pretty easy to look at and find somebody who's a good physical therapist by word of mouth, saying, who do you go see for your running injuries? It's fairly easy to find a good dietitian. I know here in Pittsburgh we have a number of them, including Leslie Bonsi. But something you hit on, mental health and finding a good professional for that. For somebody who's a runner, very often their mental issues or mental problems may not be the same as somebody who's inactive. So how does somebody go about, in your experience, when you're recommending to runners that they might need to seek a professional, how do they find somebody who maybe is equipped to deal with somebody who understands that runners are maybe a little bit crazy in a good way?
So I think it's, again, look at ask your providers. So, this year especially, I've really worked on kind of getting my team going, and I reached out to a couple of dietitians who also had relationships. So dietitians especially have a lot of relationships with mental health providers because of the eating disorder connection and the RED-S, which is a specific energy deficiency that's common with endurance athletes. So they'll have, those need to be treated with, mental health in mind. So I recently reached out to a couple of the dietitians and then got referrals I have a handful of providers that way. So I think it's the community. So I think it's about having your team and kind of starting to build your running community. So, finding people who are specializing in running and then hoping that they have a good team to refer you to. I think that's really important.
And one of the things that I think is important to emphasize with this is you don't think about your team or putting together your team when you have a problem. You think about it beforehand. So I know you and I have talked before. It used to be that you would go see a physical therapist when you were hurt, and you would never see a physical therapist before that. And I don't know how many years it's been, but the big emphasis has been, especially with, I think Shirley Sarman was one of the first people to talk about it, is maybe going and seeing a physical therapist every year for kind of a checkup. And I know when you were on our Moving to Live television show on Peters Township Public Television, you talked about the potential for runners to see you by telehealth with a kind of a running checkup. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, if you're starting out running or you're just kind of starting your season, it's a great way to kind of like all the things we just talked about. Like, let's talk about, diet and sleep. And I'm not going to get that in depth in any of that, but I can spot, hey, we need to refer this or give, advice to refer on. And getting the training, understanding the training concepts before you're in trouble, so it's a chance for us to kind of talk about training before you even start training. So, what's ahead. When you hit the first day that hurts, what to do because it's going to happen and you don't panic. And then from there we can do the movement screen, which we did with you on the TV show. And just kind of, and the idea behind the screen is to kind of load the tissue. So we know that the body has to take load, and we're going to load the tissues that are going to be loaded when you run, and just see how that person responds. Now, if they don't do perfect on the screen, it doesn't mean they can't run. It just gives us a place. It kind of helps for us to find a place to start from to build a good resistance training program, and to kind of spot areas that we can fix. Like a huge thing I'll find, two big things I'll find is that runners aren't using their big toe, especially anybody who's ever had a history of an ankle injury or a postpartum mom. Or which pretty much is kind of everybody at that point, tends to kind of lean back on our heels and on the outside of their feet. And we forget the big toe, which is huge for support. We want to have a full base of support, and also huge for push off. So just identifying that and bringing people back awareness to their toes. Are they gripping with their toes? Things like that, to kind of, so runners never think about that. And it gives me a chance to be like, hey, here's some things we can work on. And then also for women, well, this could be for anybody, but we'll see it more in women. Something that nobody ever talks about, are they leaking when they run? And we can look at, is there an issue with how they're moving through their, I hate the word core, because of the way it has been spun in the fitness world, but it's easiest to say core. How they're moving in that area can be causing, leakage, but hip pain, back pain, other things. And so can we start to clean that up a little bit? And so if we can get to that, those are other things that we can tease out in a movement screen. And then we're looking at, can they load through the knee? So a lot of people kind of squat and hinge or deadlift the exact same way, and those need to be two separate movements. And people will do that because they think that putting weight through their knee is going to be a bad thing. They've been taught to squat and never let their knee pass their toes, which is just something that needs to die. Your knees come past your toes. That's okay. We need to be able to put weight through our knee. And then we need to work on the posterior chain. We need to do hinges and deadlifts. And a lot of people just kind of jumble those all up as one movement. So can we tease those out to make sure that they can move both ways? And then a huge one is the calf. the soleus especially takes a large amount of weight. And so is the person strong enough in that area? We don't really have, we're still working on the best way to test that. I think right now we use kind of a single leg calf raise if we don't have other means of high tech testing. But it's the best we have, but we know it's not good enough. So I think there needs to be more research in that area. But we do know that we need to be seeing if people can handle some load through the calf and the Achilles and things like that.
And in an ideal world, how often would you like to see somebody, if you were working with a runner to help keep them healthy, how often should a runner think about maybe getting a running assessment or a running evaluation, or rather than saying an assessment or evaluation, just basically a checkup or a reminder of things to be concerned about?
I think it depends on the runner. If we've gone through it and they're doing well and they're keeping up with their program and they're managing things, they may not need it right away. Some people might need that, especially if they take, I want runners to have an off season, but I still want them to run in their off season. I just want them to dial it back, but some people will just shut it down in their off season. So if you've been kind of running consistently in your off season, just way dialed back and doing some strength training, you might be okay to keep going. You might not need to be checked in, but if you just shut it down, be like, okay, I'm going to start up again. And that's how, well, then you might need to, because you might have learned, things might have changed over the year. So I think it's really, I don't really say there's like a one size fits all. It's really individual. If you're so we want to do it, if you're going to start a big race, train for something really big that you haven't done before, it might be a good idea to look for something like that. I would say if you've never run before, or, you've never had an evaluation like that, it's good to have. And then from there, it just depends on how you're doing and how you're taking breaks and what's coming up, what injuries are coming up, things like that.
Great information from Kelly Kuhn. I'm not sure if we are able to have questions. I know this is actually airing on my personal Facebook account because I forgot to click the button. When we do this again, we'll make sure it's on the Fit Lab Pittsburgh, but I do see a few people there, and I'm not sure if Lisa's going to come and tell us some questions. But if not, we will. I can think of a number of questions. One of the things that you mentioned that I didn't follow up on is you mentioned pushing off with the big toe, and you mentioned that women who are postpartum, you frequently see that they don't do that. Is this for a year or two after giving birth, or is this kind of a longitudinal adaptation or something that movement pattern that they've taken up since they've given birth, and why is that?
It's common. For a lot of women, it doesn't go back. So what happens is when we have all that extra weight in front of us, so we shift back to support it. It becomes our strategy for movement. And for whatever reason, a lot of us just don't ever change that strategy back. Maybe we don't challenge the system right, and it just kind of becomes habit. And so we keep the core separated a little bit. Like we need our rib cage and our pelvis to kind of usually be stacked right up over each other. And during pregnancy, they kind of pull apart. And then we just kind of hang out there and stay there. And that changes how everything is. So now our weight is shifted back, and it doesn't allow for really good use of our core area. And then the pelvic floor, which actually a lot of times people think when they're leaking, their pelvic floor is weak. But what's actually happening is their pelvic floor is held in such a tight state to compensate for that change, that when we hit the ground, it just bulges under the pressure and it goes. And that's why women have stress urinary incontinence. And so getting them forward over the toe changes, lines them up better, takes pressure off the pelvic floor, gets them to get a better push off through their glute. It changes a whole bunch of things. It's more complex than that, but that's kind of the idea, is just kind of they just lose that connection to their body, and just kind of bringing that awareness back and bringing them back to their that posture. Granted, we are seeing that posture in people who haven't had babies. We're seeing it in young runners, especially with the way we talk about the core in the fitness world, with people telling them to draw their belly button in. We're kind of actually disconnecting that mechanism with breath holding. There's lots of things that are happening that are causing that have nothing to do with pregnancy, but I think we saw it first in pregnancy. We identified it there. It's most common there, but it's actually a lot of places. So it can happen in men too.
I know that I spent a few years in Florida, and you're a Florida native. And I think one of the happiest moments of my life is when I left Florida, because I didn't have to worry about when do I take my off season, because you could do events literally, year round because it could be 75 degrees on Christmas Day. We've got a question from Paul Serace. I know Paul's in New York City, the New York City area, and he's a dedicated runner. Some runners don't take an off season. So what's your recommendation to these runners so they don't get hurt, not only for the first off season that they skip, but so they can be a dedicated runner for 15, 20, 30 years, basically make it a lifetime activity rather than just something they do periodically?
You mean if they choose not, if they're definitely not going
to, if they choose, they're a relatively advanced runner and they choose, it's like, well, I don't take an off season because there's these variety of races that I can do year round.
Yeah. So, I mean, they just have to find a time to dial it back. I think that you have to have like lesser races. You just can't be at peak performance. So you can't be expecting to PR every race. So you can still race in your off season. You just don't necessarily want to be like training for a PR year round, So I think because consistently I still want them to run. I just think that people think when they're training, they are going as hard as they can. And our body can't sustain that. So there just needs to be a relative deload time. That doesn't mean that you can't race or you can't enjoy it or anything like that. And during that time, I want to have a relative increase in our resistance training, so we can kind of preload on that end. So that way, when we get into like, we're really working on the running and really working on the PR, we can dial back the resistance training because we have a good base there. So no, we don't have to necessarily have a true off season, but I do think there needs to be a time where we're not working on like our hardest race, just kind of a little up and down, ebb and flow really goes a long way. I would recommend a 2 months true off season for most people. But I still want them running. I just don't want them like training. I want them, because I think there's a mental health break to that, but some people can do it. There's no one size fits all. It's just that we want to make sure that we just take that load down a little bit. The other thing is taking the load down a little bit. Like if you're at max capacity, your body adapts to that. You can't just keep growing from there, right? So when you take that load back a little bit, it gives you a chance to actually build really, really again, like good again. So you kind of actually can get over a plateau where a lot of people are like, I've hit, that's as far, I'm not getting any faster, I'm not getting better. When you back off a little bit, you get that early training stimulus again. So you can kind of get over that plateau. So I think that's another benefit of backing off a little bit, is that you can actually be faster later by taking that deload period.
And I know that there are some people who are hardcore runners, and I say this with the utmost respect, they're genetic freaks. They can basically run and run and run and not take off seasons, and they don't get hurt, but that's not the majority of people. And I know one of the things that typically happens with marathons is there's a spring season often and there's a fall season, and somebody may just have this goal that, not this year, of course, but, I want to try to qualify for Boston, for example. And they qualify for Boston and they run Boston, but they also, within a short period of time, a couple of weeks, have their favorite home race. So if you're in Pittsburgh and you qualify for Boston in most years, well, a few weeks later, you've got the Pittsburgh Marathon. When you're working with runners and they come to you for advice and recommendation, how much time do you recommend that they not necessarily take off, but they finish a marathon? How much time for the typical runner that you see would you like to see before they do another marathon? And think of this just as a participation marathon rather than I'm going to PR it. They want to run the 26 miles.
I mean, I think it depends. I think it depends on when the race is. So it's not so much as that I say I don't have like strict rules for time. I think it's, we have to look at their whole history of training. Like how much did they train before? When was their last off season? Like I generally say no more than like, maybe 2 marathons in a year. But if they haven't run that, they might be able just to kind of maybe back off a little bit depending how far out the race is. So we have to work backwards from the race to see, how many miles we need to be at, maybe take them down a little bit, build them back up. And that could be enough. So they don't really necessarily need any time off after that. But then maybe after that marathon, I want like a true off season. So it really depends on the timing. Like I want runners to get their goals. I want them, I think the reason runners don't go to physical therapists is because physical therapists always shut them down and tell them they can't do that. And I don't want to do that. We want to work it out. So we have to look at the race and just figure out what's going to work for them. That's going to be a different conversation if there was an injury in that first race. That's a different conversation. Even then, though, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to shut them down. It just means we might need a little more time. So it's not an exact science. It's really looking at how much time, what they've run before, very individual. And I think that's the most important part. There's no one size fits all for this stuff.
We've been talking with Kelly Kuhn. Kelly is a physical therapist with Kelly Kuhn Physical Therapy. She works with runners and other individuals. And I think the neat thing about what Kelly does is she is involved in telehealth. So just as far as finishing up, to give people an idea, just briefly describe what telehealth is and kind of how people can get in touch with you, and also whether this is something insurance covers or insurance doesn't cover this.
So telehealth is basically like kind of what we're doing right now. So it's an appointment via Zoom, which we all know now. Nobody knew what it was when I started out. And so I think with runners, because they're so active, they don't need a lot of hands-on stuff. It's more about training and moving them forward. And so we'll go through. The first eval with a runner, I'm spending 2 to 3 hours with them, really. And we're gonna, it's a lot of talking, a lot of trying to figure out the person and understanding what their goals are, understanding them and how they tick and what's going to work for them. And then we'll look at, if there's an injury, especially, we're going to go through that eval and see if I can kind of tease out what's going on. And it's more of, now I take an approach of, it's more of a coach versus just like, I'm not here to fix people. I'm here to coach you how to get through this, how to move forward. And so I'm kind of starting to take that term more like I'm a coach, versus a PT, because I don't want to put my hands on people and just be like, oh, quick, you're better, because that's not how it works. I want to educate and help them do this in the most healthy way possible. So we're going to, look through what we can find, tweak the training program. Sometimes I have them send me videos of them running, and I'll look at it to see if I can fix things that we can play with there. A lot of times I'll play with cadence, sometimes I'll use a few cues, and then we'll develop an exercise program that they can stick to. And then they come back to me when we need to tweak the program, so, and they have access to me. So as a coach, like, hey, I ran this many miles today and I felt good. What should I do next? Versus just, here's your program, go on. I'm there kind of following them, but I don't need full visits for that. We just need full visits when it's time to maybe increase their exercises and progress their exercises, if they want to do that. And so it does. So now it's all over the place with insurance. I don't know 100% what is or isn't. I personally am out of network or take private pay because I want to be able to spend a lot of time with people. And so the way insurance is, you can't do that. So in order for me to spend 2 to 3 hours with a patient, I just can't do that through insurance, but I try to keep the price very reasonable to account, and then the visits down. Like, I don't do the traditional 3 times a week who has time for that? The goal is, here's what we do. We kind of follow in via email and text and wherever else we need to. And then, in a few weeks, we'll check in again. If something comes up, we can always do a visit. So I try to only do, as many visits as I need, but still giving them lots of information. So I think for the most part, it's kept the cost reasonable for most people. And I don't see I haven't had any struggles yet with why. The hardest part is positioning the camera. Like when we're going through, sometimes I'll be like, hey, we got to move the camera a little bit, move the camera. That's a little annoying. But other than that, it's not hard.
And it's part of having your movement team. We've been talking with Kelly Kuhn. We're going to try to do this periodically. And if we do, we'll start publicizing it on social media so you can have questions and maybe have a question and answer if you don't want to type a question in. Kelly, I want to thank you for talking about running and potential ways to keep running without getting hurt with Fitness Lab Pittsburgh. If you're listening to this either live or not, make sure you check out Fitness Lab Pittsburgh. We promote movement in the Pittsburgh area. We believe movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. And if you want to have a little bit of amusement on all the social media channels at FITLABPGH, we promote movement tip and lifestyle hacks every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We'll have show notes for this, but for Kelly, for people who want to get in touch with you, what's the easiest way for them to get in touch with you?
You can go to my website, which is kellykuhnpt.com, or email me at kelly@kellykuhnpt. and pt.com. It's made it my name to make it easy. One of these days, I keep saying I'm going to have a contest to help me find a better name, but everything's under Kelly Kuhn. So you can look that up. You should be able to find me.
We'll have this published in a few days. And Kelly, thanks again for taking time to talk to FitLab PGH.
Thanks for having me again.